Hi everybody and welcome to my virtual world. I'm Ginn and I run courses here in Hereford and round and about, mainly sewing courses, but textile courses, art courses. I belong to Creative Breaks and we are an organisation of independent short course providers, and we come to Helen's once a year and showcase what we can offer you as an organisation. So I've been asked to give a little talk, and sadly we can't be together in a beautiful marquee in that beautiful garden at Helen's, but I'm happy to do this virtually and to showcase what I do, and to really impart some of my knowledge and my passion for sewing and for upcycling, recycling, make, do and mend. I like the title of the theme for Helen's, and I think it's running through to next year as well, sowing the seeds for change. And the play on words is actually perfect, sowing seeds and sewing with thread. But essentially, for me, sowing the seeds for change in attitude is what I want to put across, that we need to make sure that we are not just throwing away our clothes, but we can really make a difference by upcycling them and mending and refashioning them. So really, essentially, this talk is about showing you some of the things that I've done, and giving you some tips and methods, and to hopefully inspire you to kind of go away and kind of have a go at it, and hopefully when we're all back to normal, I might see some of you here in my studio on a course. And I must apologise for if I'm stumbling over words, because being in front of the camera is a real challenge. But this is the way it's going to go, I think, for quite some time. So some of my courses might be having to be delivered virtually. Anyway, I hope you enjoy what I have to say, and hopefully see you next year in the flesh, in a beautiful Helen's garden. This little mini dress featured here is actually made from a man's vest, and I think it captures the essence of the make, do and mend ethos of the Second World War, when a lot of clothes, particularly for children, would have been made out of adult clothes and men's clothes. So a child might have a little dress made out of a father's shirt, and that would have captured a really lovely feeling of attachment to perhaps somebody that was away at war, and the child would then have a reminder of somebody special. So this little dress here is bound with a bias ribbon around the neck and arms, and a bit around the bottom, and we've got some broderie anglaise also attached. The ribbon here is attached using a 3-step zigzag, which is actually one of my favourite stitches and one of the most useful that you can have on your machine, but a bit more on that one later. So it's a very secure stitch, but it's looking quite pretty, and it doesn't make it look so flat, so it corresponds with the broderie anglaise there. I really love this image. It was taken in 1941. It shows a woman out shopping, and she's actually wearing a coat made from a candlewick bedspread. and the ingenuity and the style is just remarkable. So I have actually been able to replicate this the best way that I can. I actually couldn't believe my luck when I found a white candlewick bedspread in a charity shop. So there was no excuse but to crack on and try and replicate this coat. I used an embroidered tablecloth here for the yoke and the edging on the tablecloth for that collar and to edge the pockets. And then this bit down the front, which is beautifully pin tucked, really fine, lovely cotton. That was from a bed sheet. So lots of different elements incorporated into this coat. And I think nobody would have actually really blinked an eye when she walked down the street in her coat, because they would have actually seen somebody who'd used their skills and their ingenuity to make something really rather smart. I have to say it was absolutely awful to sew. Candlewick fabric is not meant to be fashioned in this way, kept breaking needles, but I persevered. I have been so lucky over the years to build up a collection of vintage clothes from all decades, and I really enjoy using these in my teaching because we can learn so much from what has been done before. And some of these little techniques are sort of forgotten about, and I think we need to reintroduce them. So people know that I like to collect, and I have had these items gifted to me from friends and family. And over a period of time, I have begun to realize that there is so much to learn from really being a bit of a detective and delving into and inside these garments so that we can gain some information and some knowledge and really get inspired by what's being done so that we can use that to upcycle some clothes, or even if it's not such a big project, just to add trims and to finish edges. So I will be delving into some of these garments and showing you a few tips and what you can do. These lovely examples of dresses here, this wedding dress from the 1920s and this lovely bias cut dress from the 1930s and the wedding dress from the 1940s, all have the same gathering technique on there. And I think covering 3 decades, it's quite interesting to have found that they're using the same thing over that period of time. And so to refashion a garment, to make it smaller, to shape it, this is rather a nice gathering technique that you can use. So this is a beautiful picture showing Harry and Edith Macklin, May 1927, on their wedding day. And what's interesting is that it is actually my husband's grandma, and they are actually standing outside the front of our house where we live. And the lilac tree that you can see on the right hand side is still blooming every year. And quite recently I put the wedding dress back in the tree just to honour her and to honour the person who made it. So I'm very honoured to have this dress in my possession, and it is incredibly fragile at the moment, so I have to be very careful. The sewing skills that are displayed here are really exquisite. And so the gathering stitch is actually 3 rows of gathering, and they are featured on the shoulder, but also at that very distinct 1920s waistline. So it's not just one gathering stitch and one gathering line, it is several in a row. and it makes for a very interesting feature. So here is the 1930s dress, and I think it's my favourite out of my collection, and I've worn it a couple of times to weddings. It is the most comfortable dress to wear, and it has such a beautiful back to it. So on the shoulder we've got about 5 rows of running stitches which are gathered up to make this cluster of gathers. And then on to the 1940s wedding dress. So this is actually my latest acquisition, and that has come from somebody who knew that I wanted to keep collecting. And what's rather sweet is that it's got a little handwritten label which said, "My wedding dress, 1947. And once again, we can see here we've got this gathering. It's got 1, 2, 3 rows of gathering, just to emphasize that shoulder. And of course, in the 1940s, even on a wedding dress, the shoulder was key. There was this emphasis, which we saw in the 1980s, and it was influenced by military uniform. So even in this wedding dress, you can see this emphasis on the shoulder line. But once again, we can just see that this little gathering technique gives it much more interest and texture. So following on from those examples of gathering, I've got a couple of samples here where it's replicating that gathering, but it's actually using shearing elastic in the bobbin. And so you get this stretch here, and it is mimicking a smocking stitch, but what you do is that shearing elastic is put into the bobbin and it gathers as you sew. It can take a bit of practice, but it gives you a lovely quick finish for gathering, and it looks rather nice on that satin here. Now, as we've just been talking about smocking, I thought I must show you this example of the most beautiful smocking. So this is actually a nightie, and the work involved in this is incredible, not only in the smocking but in the edging, which I'll show you a bit later on. For those of you who are partial to a frill, these are some samples of what you can do with just some strips of fabric. And quite simply, you are going to put a gathering stitch up the centre or on the sides. And it's a great way of using up scraps of fabric, but you can enhance a cuff or a neckline or down the centre and make a feature of this. And so here we've got these which are not neatened in any way like this one, and so you get this sort of fraying edge, which is rather nice, choosing the right fabric of course to do that. So the running stitch just gets drawn up simply like that, and you could make these as narrow or as wide as you want, depending on the effect that you want. So on this dress, we've just got strips of fabric which haven't been neatened, and they've just been placed on here to emphasize the neckline. And then these are strips which have actually been gathered. This beautiful dressing gown from 1936 actually belonged to my great aunt, and this is part of her wedding trousseau, so her dressing gown, and it shows a very lovely detail which was very kind of popular in the 1920s but then carried on through to the 1930s. And so this detail is using that gather stitch on the edges of a strip of fabric. So what's clever about this garment is that that trim is actually the underside of the main fabric, so you get that satin finish, just giving that little bit of a shine to that edging. And here is a modern garment using exactly the same technique, with the gathering on the edges of that strip and enhancing that neckline and onto the pockets. So this jacket's actually been in my wardrobe for a number of years. I keep looking at it, trying to decide what to do to make it workable. It was pretty shapeless and didn't have much texture on it. So what I've done is just pinned it here to shape in at the waist, but started to actually do this running stitch on the collar and shoulders and down the front, just to bring it to life a little bit. So I really like this type of stitching, and you see it a lot in Indian textiles, this kantha work. And really what I'm doing is just bring a bit of texture to that area and highlighting it. So I'm not going to stitch all over, I'm just going to keep this quite simple in places, just to bring a bit of interest, and hopefully it'll make it more wearable. So just fashioning it in at the waist will give it some shape. I love the tailoring on this jacket, a little hacking jacket, so beautifully fashioned, and it was in a very sorry state when I got it, so I had to work really hard on the inside and to repair the lining, but the outside just lent itself to being quite simply upcycled, just changing the buttons and picking up that orange, there's a little orange fleck in the tweed, and stitching with a different coloured thread, and then laying in this sort of antique lace around the collar and the cuffs, and then to put a bit of hand embroidery with some French knots, just to give a little bit of interest. So I love the detailing on this Victorian nightdress. There's been so much love put into this, with this beautiful crocheted edging and this amazing hand embroidered stitch all the way around, enhancing these seams. And what's lovely about this is that it's not standing out because it's same colour as the fabric. So it just gives it this lovely texture. But I've used that to influence the upcycle of this little jacket. So in the true spirit of make, do and mend, I am upcycling this shrunken cardigan into a little girl's coat. And I wanted to enhance some of the edges by using the embroidery stitch influence from the Victorian nightie. So this stitch is coming along here and just around the shoulder there. I wanted to return to this really beautiful nightie because of the love that has gone into making this. So not only is it the exquisite embroidery on the smocking, but actually I realised that all the edges have got this scallop, this sort of shell stitch, all done by hand. So not only on the ties and around this neckline, but actually on the hem as well. So all hand done. But we can actually mimic that, not having to do it by hand, but actually on the sewing machine. So these samples here have been done on the sewing machine to mimic that shell stitch, and it works very effectively. You have to work at it a little bit depending on the fabric, but it's just a zigzag which has had the tensions changed so that it's pulling that edge in, and a lot easier than doing it by hand. So what we've got here on this upcycle, which was from an old cardigan and a t-shirt, I made this little girl's top, teenager's little top, but it is a good example of using that three-step zigzag that I mentioned before. So we've got it anchoring the two fabrics together rather than just a straight stitch or a zigzag, which can pucker, particularly when there's a stretch fabric going on here. So that three-step is very useful, but it's also strong and decorative. During the make, do and mend era, if you had a repair or a darn, it was actually seen as a badge of honour. And I think that attitude is something that we could adopt today. So to repair your clothes and to actually have something upcycled can be seen as a badge of honour, so that you're doing your bit for the environment and for our resources. And that three-step zigzag is actually a very good stitch to repair a tear or a hole, and because it is so strong and it doesn't pucker across the fabric, it is a really good stitch all round. You can see why it's one of my favourites. This example here just shows what you can do with some strips of fabric and just by plaiting them. So with a woven fabric or a knitted fabric, as in a sort of t-shirt fabric, which would be great to trim a neckline on a t-shirt that had worn, but it creates a very interesting trim if you change the colours or even keep it self-coloured. So this jacket here shows it before and after, and it was very, very plain, very straightforward, no shaping whatsoever. So I wanted to have a little sense of drama with this one, so I turned it into a tailcoat. So it's something that I think everybody should have, is a tailcoat. but the fabric really needed lifting. So the orange free machine embroidery is done to really give it texture and to sort of breathe a bit of colour into it. And that was really quite a challenge to just make sure that that fabric didn't pucker and move too much, but I think it's been quite successful. So I thought I'd actually round this talk off by looking at buttons. Here there is just a very small sample of what I have in my collection. And so I would never throw a button away. I would remove buttons off garments that had really no life left in them or have to be used for rags. But always save those buttons because even odd buttons work together can look quite effective. So using contrast buttons or contrast thread, and you can see here stitched in a variety of formations, can just be enough to lift a garment. Or what I rather like doing is to embroider fabric and then cover buttons so they become really unique. Anyway, thanks for listening, everybody. I hope that's been of interest, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your virtual Helen's Garden Festival. Bye for now.